This is the news in brief from the United Nations. The trial of a paramilitary commander who is accused of carrying out or ordering crimes against humanity and war crimes in the Central African Republic began on Monday in The Hague. Mohamed Said Abdelkani, a top-ranking leader of the Seleka militia, pleaded not guilty to all charges which relate to atrocities carried out in 2013 in the Central African Republic capital Bangui. Before the crimes were committed, from late 2012 to early 2013, Seleka militia advanced towards the capital, attacking police stations, occupying military bases, capturing towns and regional capitals, and targeting suspected supporters of President François Bozize. They seized Bangui in March 2013 and, with forces numbering up to 20,000, looted homes while searching for sympathisers of Mr. Bozize and shot those fleeing in the back or killed others in their homes. Mr. Kani's charge sheet includes imprisonment, torture, persecution, enforced disappearance and other inhumane acts committed in Bangui between approximately April and November 2013. He oversaw the day-to-day operations of an infamous detention centre, according to the court, and was operations commander at another, where he kept a list of persons to be arrested. To South Sudan, where deeply disturbing violence is escalating all over the country. Top independent human rights experts have warned women and girls continue to be gang raped, and survivors have been described as zombies, physically and emotionally dead, according to the UN Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan. In an alert, Commission chairperson Yasmin Suka said that it was critical for the international community to monitor the country's peace agreement, along with other reforms, including of the armed forces and the constitution. Transitional justice bodies are also urgently needed, as per an agreement made 4 years ago by the country's government, the Commission noted. Without these steps, we are likely to see millions more South Sudanese displaced or crossing borders, creating havoc for neighbouring countries and aid agencies, Ms. Suka said. The Independent Rights Panel, which was established by the Human Rights Council in 2016, said that women raped by armed forces while collecting firewood are threatened with death if they report it. Often the police are too ill-equipped to do their job, and they cannot arrest a soldier who's better armed and protected, the Commission said in a recent statement. Torture is systematically practiced in Venezuela, and it's sanctioned at the highest level to suppress opposition voices, the Human Rights Council has heard. In a new report, head of the independent international fact-finding mission on Venezuela stated that 2 state intelligence agencies were responsible for crimes against humanity. In addition to torture, the agencies, 1 military and 1 civilian intelligence service, carried out sexual and gender-based violence, arbitrary detentions and short-term enforced disappearances. The rights report continued. The highest-ranking officers of each agency report directly to the country's highest-level political authorities, the Human Rights Council heard, while the report also noted that most victims were officers and former officers of the armed forces or their associates. Human rights violations by both agencies continue to this day, according to the report, which maintained that the agencies are part of a system designed and deployed to repress opponents. Daniel Johnson, UN News. This is the news in brief from the United Nations. The continuing violent response by Iranian security forces to large protests in Iran, sparked by the death in custody of Mahsa Amini, prompted a fresh call on Tuesday from the UN for an investigation. Firearms must never be used simply to disperse an assembly, the UN Human Rights Office OHCHR said in a statement. It noted that many Iranians had been killed, injured and detained during demonstrations that followed Ms. Amini's arrest by Iran's morality police in Tehran for not respecting strict rules regarding the hijab. The 22-year-old woman fell into a coma shortly after collapsing at a detention centre 2 weeks ago. The official cause of death was a heart attack. OHCHR spokesperson Ravina Shamdasani told journalists in Geneva that the impacts of the protests on Iranian society had been significant. She described an outpouring of anger on the streets at Ms. Amini's death and the lack of an adequate investigation by the authorities, whose response had been to partially shut down communications. In Russia, nearly 2,400 people have reportedly been arrested for protesting against the Kremlin's mobilization call to fight in Ukraine, the UN Human Rights Office OHCHR said on Tuesday. Arrests have happened in various parts of the country, said OHCHR spokesperson Ravina Shamdasani. She said that in the Dagestan capital, Machakala, protests continued on Monday, with hundreds of people taking to the streets and clashing with police officers, resulting in dozens of arrests.
We stress that arresting people solely for exercising their rights of peaceful assembly and freedom of expression constitutes an arbitrary deprivation of liberty. We call for the immediate release of all those arbitrarily detained and for the authorities to abide by their international obligations to respect and ensure the rights to freedom of expression and of peaceful assembly.
Ms. Shamdasani noted that there had been reports of men mistakenly called up despite having no prior military training, and that the authorities had set up a hotline to rectify the situation. While the majority of the protests are reported to have been peaceful, military and administrative buildings, including enlistment offices, have been attacked in several regions. Good news now from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC, where nearly 6,000 Congolese refugees have been helped to return home from Zambia after being forced to flee political and inter-ethnic violence. Announcing the development, the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, said that the returnees fled clashes in DR Congo's southeast region in 2017. Security has improved in some areas of Haut-Katanga province, making the returns possible since December last year, the UN agency explained. It added that those going home expressed excitement and looked forward to reuniting with family and friends. Returnees receive cash assistance to help cover basic expenses upon arriving home. This covers transportation to their destination, hygiene and household items, and initial rent assistance. Additional reintegration assistance, such as helping children in enrolling in school, is also being provided. Daniel Johnson, UN News. This is the news in brief from the United Nations. New global guidelines on preventing work-related mental health problems have been released by the UN, along with practical strategies to help employers and workers alike. An estimated 12 billion workdays are lost annually owing to depression and anxiety, and this costs the global economy nearly $1 trillion, according to the UN Health Agency WHO and the UN Labour Agency ILO. The guidelines, which are available online, recommend actions to tackle some of the issues that lead to mental health problems, such as heavy workloads and negative behaviour. Recommendations include manager training to help identify and prevent stressful work environments and to respond to workers in distress. Bullying and psychological violence, that's also known as mobbing, are key complaints in the workplace that are associated with mental health problems, WHO and ILO noted. But they said that discussing or disclosing mental health remains a taboo in work settings globally. In a survey of 1 billion people living with a mental disorder in 2019, WHO found that 15% of working-age adults had a mental disorder. The chances of today's global food access crisis becoming one of food availability tomorrow remains a real threat without urgent action from the world's wealthiest nations, the Food and Agriculture Agency, FAO, said on Wednesday. FAO chief Kyu Dong-yu made the appeal to agriculture ministers from the world's 20 strongest economies, who are meeting under the G20 banner in Bali. Although there have been some improved forecasts for wheat and soybean markets, the outlook for maize, rice and fertilizers is marred by supply constraints and volatility, according to FAO data. Mr. Kyu said that the UN-backed Black Sea Grain Initiative had provided an important step forward in promoting exports from Russia and Ukraine despite the war. But the agreement needs to be complemented to improve the food access of most vulnerable countries, the FAO chief said, pointing to his agency's Food Import Financing Facility proposal, which is now being coordinated by the International Monetary Fund. The idea of the financing facility is to provide funds to 62 lower-income food importing countries that are home to almost 1.8 billion people to meet their most urgent needs. To Iran, where top rights experts urged the authorities on Wednesday to halt the executions of 2 LGBT activists who've been sentenced to death. Zahra Siddiqui Hamadani and Elam Chubda were prosecuted last month and convicted of corruption on earth and trafficking. The women learned on the 1st of September that a court in the western city of Urmia had signed their death sentence. In Iran, homosexuality and same-sex relations are punishable by death. The rights experts who report to the UN Human Rights Council said that they'd expressed their concerns to the government of Iran, but that to date no response had been received. Authorities have an international obligation to ensure that all human rights defenders in Iran can conduct peaceful and legitimate activities without fear of persecution or reprisals, including those working on sensitive issues such as sexual orientation and gender identity, the rights experts said in a statement. Daniel Johnson, UN News. This is the news in brief from the United Nations. 2 months since the Black Sea Grain Initiative kicked into action to help release desperately needed grain and fertilizer from ports in Ukraine and Russia, confidence is returning among global distributors as exports ramp up, the UN said on Thursday. To date, the agreement between the UN, Turkey, Russia and Ukraine has allowed almost 240 vessels to leave Ukrainian ports, with some 5.4 million tonnes of grain and other foodstuffs. Here's Dennis Malone, a UN representative at the Joint Coordination Centre in Odessa.
What I'm seeing with the Black Sea Grain Initiative is an increase in confidence. Confidence in the shipping community, the commercial shipping community. We're seeing the price of shipping insurance reduce. We're seeing the quality of ships that are being used to come in to export the grain increasing. But we're also seeing an increase in confidence in the local community, in the farming community. They're starting to see that their grain is being exported, that the silos are being emptied, and that they can start planning for future harvests.
One ship leaving Odessa earlier this week, the BC Vanessa, is the fourth humanitarian vessel to be chartered by the UN World Food Programme, WFP, out of Ukraine. Its precious cargo, 30,000 tonnes of wheat, is destined for Afghanistan to alleviate the desperate humanitarian emergency there. Other UN shipments taking part in the initiative have already delivered wheat to Ethiopia and Yemen. People in 42 different countries across the world faced reprisals and intimidation after cooperating with the United Nations on human rights. That's one of the disturbing findings of the annual report by the UN Secretary-General on the issue. It details how victims of human rights violations, rights activists and journalists have suffered reprisals and intimidation by states and non-state actors. Abuses have included people being detained, targeted by restrictive legislation and followed online and offline. All of the reported cases happened between May 2021 and April this year and involved individuals and groups who cooperated with UN human rights mechanisms or used UN procedures to seek help for human rights violations. A bid to stop a malaria-carrying mosquito that's from outside Africa, taking an even greater hold in the east and west of the continent, is underway, supported by the UN Health Agency, it said on Thursday. According to the World Health Organization, WHO, the Anopheles stevensii mosquito is originally from South Asia and the Arabian Peninsula, but it's been spotted in increasing numbers in Djibouti, Ethiopia, Sudan, Somalia and Nigeria. Unlike the other main mosquito vectors of malaria in Africa, it thrives in urban settings, the WHO said in a statement, which also noted that more than 40% of Africans now live in towns. WHO's approach involves increasing cooperation and mosquito surveillance across borders, and the UN agency has urged national health authorities to share any reported sightings. Daniel Johnson, UN News. This is the news in brief from the United Nations. The UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process, Tor Wennesland, has expressed his sadness at the death of a 7-year-old boy who died during Israeli army manoeuvres in the occupied West Bank. According to reports, Rayan Suleiman died after running away from Israeli Defense Forces soldiers in the Palestinian town of Tikwa, near Bethlehem. He showed no signs of physical trauma and the cause of death appeared to be from heart failure, a medical officer reportedly said. In a tweet on Thursday, Mr. Wennesland described Rayan's death as tragic before calling for an immediate and thorough investigation. Only 2 days ago, the UN Special Envoy expressed his deep concern about escalating instability in the West Bank after 4 Palestinians were killed in Jenin in armed exchanges during an operation by the Israeli military. More than 2 years since the killing of George Floyd by a police officer in the US sparked the global Black Lives Matter movement, there's been only piecemeal progress to address systemic racism across the world, the UN Human Rights Office said on Friday. A new report from the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR, notes continuing allegations of discriminatory treatment, unlawful deportations, excessive use of force, and deaths of African migrants and migrants of African descent by law enforcement officials. One example was the abuse aimed at African students and workers in Ukraine as they tried to leave the country shortly after the Russian invasion in February. The situation did improve once concerns were raised, said OHCHR spokesperson Ravina Shamdasani. She also told journalists in Geneva that activism to address racism against people of African descent globally had led to increased recognition that the problem is systemic, yielding concrete initiatives in some countries. But she noted that achieving justice for people of African descent who've died at the hands of the police remains extremely difficult and slow.
It remains shocking that none of these cases have come to a conclusion after so many years. Adama Traoré in France was killed in 2016. We're now in 2022. Luana Barbosa dos Reis Santos was also killed in 2016. We are now in 2022.
The Human Rights Office spokesperson pointed to practical measures that countries can take to promote racial justice and equality. These include supporting high-level events which allow for the voices of people of African descent to be heard to address systemic racism, OHCHR said. To Afghanistan, where a suspected suicide bomber attack on a school in Kabul on Friday morning has claimed the lives of more than 20 teenagers. It's been condemned in the strongest terms by UN humanitarians. According to reports, young boys and girls were killed after an attacker entered the Kaj Educational Centre in the Dasht el-Baki district of West Kabul. UN Children's Fund UNICEF said in a statement that it was appalled by the horrific incident. The victims were practicing for a university entrance exam, the UN agency said, noting that in addition to those killed, many more were severely injured. Children should never be a target, UNICEF said, adding that violence in or around educational establishments is never acceptable. Such places must be havens of peace where children can learn, be with friends and feel safe as they build skills for their futures, it said. Daniel Johnson, UN News.